The drought had been merciless. For 18 months, the Texas sky hung pale and cloudless over the Mercer Ranch, turning green pastures into cracked earth and dust. Tom Mercer stood at his kitchen window, watching his last dozen cattle gather around the nearly empty water trough. His wife Sarah had left 3 years ago, tired of the struggle, tired of the isolation, tired of him. His 2 grown children had long since moved to Dallas, chasing careers that didn't involve waking at dawn to feed dying livestock. At 53, Tom faced the collapse of everything his grandfather had built. The bank letters came weekly now, printed on crisp white paper that seemed to mock him with its cleanliness. Final notice. Foreclosure proceedings. Auction date scheduled. The words blurred together as Tom sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty whiskey bottle beside him. He'd already sold the tractors, the good horses, most of the herd. What remained wouldn't cover a quarter of his debt. The ranch that had sustained 3 generations would die with him, and he'd be lucky to walk away with enough money for a security deposit on some apartment in town. It was desperation that led him to the rail yard that morning. He'd heard whispers at the feed store, careful conversations that stopped when strangers approached. Men who needed workers but couldn't afford proper wages. Boys from across the border who'd work for food and shelter, sending their meager earnings back to families even more desperate than Tom's. He told himself he just wanted information, just wanted to see if there was some legal way to hire temporary help. But when he pulled his rusted pickup into the gravel lot behind the abandoned warehouse, he knew he was crossing a line he could never uncross. The man who approached his truck wore expensive boots and a cold smile. His name was Rojas, and he spoke with the practiced ease of someone who'd made this pitch 1,000 times. Boys who were strong, obedient, grateful for the opportunity. No paperwork, no complications, just cash up front and a worker who'd ask no questions. Tom's hands trembled on the steering wheel as Rojas quoted prices like he was selling livestock. Younger boys cost less, Rojas explained, because they ate less and could squeeze into tight spaces for repair work. Older boys cost more because they could handle heavier labor. Tom nearly drove away. He should have driven away. But then Rojas mentioned a boy, 12 years old, who'd been with them for 2 months. The boy's family owed money, Rojas said, and the boy was working off the debt. He was small but strong, quiet but smart. And because the boy had been difficult, refusing some of the harder placements, Rojas would make a deal. Half price. Tom heard himself asking questions. How much? How long? What if someone found out? Rojas's answers came smooth as oil, assurances and promises that dissolved like morning mist under scrutiny. The boy was brought out from a rusted shipping container that served as their holding area. He was thin, his clothes too large and stained with dirt. His name was Miguel, Rojas said, though Tom suspected that might not be true. The boy's eyes met Tom's for just a moment, dark and watchful, before dropping to the ground. There was no pleading in those eyes, no hope, just a weary acceptance that made Tom's stomach turn. This was what he'd become. A man so broken by circumstance that he'd buy a child's labor to save a failing dream. Tom pulled out his wallet with shaking hands. He counted out bills he couldn't afford to spend, money that should have gone to the electric company. Rojas pocketed the cash and shoved Miguel toward the truck. The boy climbed into the passenger seat without a word, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back. As Tom drove away from that rail yard, dust rising behind his truck, he couldn't look at the small figure beside him. He told himself this was business, a transaction, a temporary solution. But the weight of what he'd done settled over him like a shroud, and the road ahead had never seemed darker. The first 3 days passed in near silence. Tom set Miguel up in the small room off the barn that had once been his hired hands' quarters, back when the ranch could afford hired hands. The space held a narrow bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a window that looked out over the eastern pasture. Tom brought blankets that smelled of cedar from the hall closet and a pillow that had been Sarah's. He stood in the doorway, wanting to say something, anything, but Miguel had already turned away, sitting on the edge of the bed with his back rigid and his hands folded in his lap. Work began before sunrise. Tom woke Miguel by knocking on the barn door, and the boy appeared within minutes, fully dressed, his face unreadable. Tom demonstrated the morning routine, feeding the remaining cattle, checking water levels, mucking out the barn, mending fence where the wire had rusted through. Miguel watched with absolute concentration, his dark eyes tracking every movement, every gesture. When Tom handed him tools, the boy's hands moved with surprising competence. He'd worked before, that much was clear. These weren't the uncertain movements of a child learning new tasks but the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned that mistakes brought consequences. Tom tried to convince himself this was acceptable. The boy was fed, sheltered, safer here than wherever he'd been before. Tom cooked simple meals, eggs and toast for breakfast, sandwiches for lunch, canned soup and bread for dinner. Miguel ate without comment, quickly and completely, as if the food might be taken away if he hesitated. He never asked for anything, never complained, never spoke unless directly questioned, and even then his answers came in the shortest possible forms. Yes. No. I understand. Tom found the silence oppressive, a constant reminder of the terrible transaction that bound them. The ranch work was brutal in the heat. Tom watched Miguel haul water buckets that seemed nearly as large as the boy himself, his thin arms straining with effort. When they worked on fence repair, Miguel's hands wrapped around the wire cutters and post driver with determination, though the tools were clearly too large for him. Tom saw the blisters forming on the boy's palms and felt something crack inside his chest. He went to the barn and returned with work gloves, old ones that had belonged to his son. Miguel took them without meeting Tom's eyes, pulled them on over his damaged hands, and returned to work. In the evenings, Tom sat on the porch with his whiskey while Miguel retreated to his room. Sometimes Tom heard movement from the barn, soft sounds that might have been crying or might have been prayer. He never investigated. What would he say? What comfort could he offer when he was the source of the boy's captivity? The stars came out brilliant and cold over the ranch, and Tom remembered nights when Sarah would sit beside him, when his children were young and sleeping safely in their beds, when the ranch felt like a kingdom instead of a prison. By the fourth day, Tom's conscience was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest until breathing hurt. He'd spent his whole life considering himself a good man, a fair man, someone who helped neighbors and paid his debts and treated people with respect. Now he couldn't meet his own eyes in the bathroom mirror while shaving. The boy working in his barn was a living indictment, proof that desperation could corrode principles he'd thought were bedrock solid. Every time he saw Miguel lift something heavy or work in the sun without complaint, Tom felt the last pieces of his self-respect crumbling away. The bank statement arrived on Thursday, and Tom opened it with dread that turned to confusion. His balance was exactly where he'd left it, but attached was a notice about the foreclosure. He had 30 days. 1 month to either pay what he owed or lose everything. Tom did the math for the 100th time, and for the 100th time, the numbers didn't work. Even with Miguel's unpaid labor, even if he sold everything he had left, he'd fall short by thousands. The terrible irony wasn't lost on him, he'd compromised his principles for nothing. The ranch would die anyway, and now he'd carry the additional burden of having bought a child's freedom to watch that death in slow motion. That evening, Tom cooked an actual meal. He thawed chicken from the freezer, made rice and vegetables, even attempted biscuits though they came out slightly burned. He called Miguel in from the barn and set 2 plates on the table. The boy hesitated in the doorway, uncertain. Tom gestured to the chair, and Miguel sat, his eyes fixed on the plate with an expression Tom couldn't read. They ate in silence, but it felt different somehow, less oppressive. When Miguel finished, he looked up, and for the first time, their eyes met and held. Tom opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain, but no words came. What explanation could possibly suffice? Instead, he asked a question. Do you have family, Miguel? People who miss you? The boy's face shuttered immediately, walls slamming back into place. But he nodded, once, a tiny movement that spoke of enormous loss. Tom's throat tightened. I'm going to find a way to make this right, he said, the words surprising him as they emerged. I don't know how yet, but I will. Miguel's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, doubt perhaps, or the dangerous ember of hope. The storm that had been building finally broke on Saturday morning. Tom woke to thunder rattling the windows and rain hammering the roof with an intensity he'd almost forgotten. He rushed outside in his boots and undershirt, face turned up to the sky, feeling water stream down his skin for the first time in months. The rain fell in sheets, torrential and relentless, turning the dust to mud and filling the dry creek beds with rushing water. It was too much water too fast, the kind of deluge that would cause flooding rather than relief, but in that moment Tom didn't care. The sky had finally answered. He found Miguel standing outside the barn, soaked to the skin, his face tilted upward with an expression of pure wonder. The boy's hair was plastered to his head, his oversized shirt clinging to his thin frame, and he was smiling. It was the first smile Tom had seen, and it transformed the boy's face completely, revealing the child beneath the survival instinct. Without thinking, Tom laughed, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in years, and Miguel's smile widened. For just a moment, they weren't captor and captive, buyer and bought, but simply 2 people grateful for rain. The moment shattered when Tom noticed the water rising. The creek that ran through his eastern pasture was overflowing its banks, brown water surging across the low ground where his remaining cattle were grazing. He shouted for Miguel and ran toward the fence, the boy sprinting beside him without hesitation. The cattle were panicking, milling in confusion as the water rose around their legs. If they didn't move them to higher ground quickly, they'd lose them to the flood. Everything Tom had left was standing in that rising water, and the fences would trap them as surely as jail cells. Tom and Miguel worked with frantic urgency, Tom cutting fence while Miguel waved and shouted, driving the cattle toward the opening. The boy showed no fear of the large animals, darting between them with agility, using a stick to guide them toward safety. Tom's hands were numb on the wire cutters, rain blinding him, but he kept cutting, section after section, creating an exit path. One of the young steers slipped in the mud, its legs splaying as it bellowed in terror. Miguel was there instantly, somehow getting behind the animal, pushing and shouting until it found its footing and scrambled up the slope. When the last animal was safe on high ground, Tom stood gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs. Miguel leaned against the fence post, breathing hard, covered in mud and water. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, recognition of partnership, of having faced crisis together and survived. Tom reached out and squeezed the boy's shoulder, meaning to convey gratitude, and Miguel didn't flinch away. Instead, he nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement that maybe, possibly, they'd begun to build something that transcended the ugly transaction that had brought them together. The rain continued through the afternoon, and they retreated to the barn to wait it out. Tom found old towels and dry clothes, a shirt of his that hung like a dress on Miguel's small frame. They sat on hay bales watching water pour off the roof, and Tom felt compelled to break the silence that had defined their arrangement. He started talking, words spilling out unchecked. He told Miguel about the ranch, about his grandfather who'd built it from nothing, about his father who'd expanded it during good years, about his own failures and the drought and the debt. He talked about Sarah leaving, about his children choosing different lives, about the crushing loneliness of being the last Mercer to care about this land. Miguel listened without interrupting, his dark eyes never leaving Tom's face. When Tom finally fell silent, exhausted by confession, the boy spoke more words than Tom had heard from him combined. "My father had land too," Miguel said, his English careful and accented. "In Chihuahua. 3 hectares, with goats. The cartel wanted to use it, and when he said no, they killed him. My mother took me to the border because she said dead men's sons don't live long. She paid someone to take me across, to find me work. She's still there, waiting for money I can't send." His voice remained steady, but tears mixed with rainwater on his cheeks. Tom felt like he'd been punched. This boy hadn't been some random victim of circumstance but someone whose father had been murdered for refusing criminals, whose mother had made the impossible choice to send her child away to save his life. And Tom, in his desperation, had become another link in the chain of people who'd exploited that tragedy. The shame was overwhelming, crushing, absolute. He stood abruptly and walked to the barn door, staring out at the rain-soaked land that suddenly felt tainted by his actions. "I'm sorry," Tom said, his voice rough. "Miguel, I'm so sorry. What I did, buying you from those men, it was wrong. There's no excuse. I was desperate to save this place, but that doesn't justify what I did to you." He turned back to face the boy. "I'm going to fix this. I don't know how, but I promise you, I'll get you back to your mother. I'll find a way to make you safe." Miguel's expression was skeptical, the look of someone who'd heard promises before and learned they meant nothing. But he didn't argue, didn't contradict, just watched Tom with those patient, ancient eyes. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the rain finally taper off, his mind working through possibilities and obstacles. He couldn't just drive Miguel back across the border, the boy would be picked up immediately, either by Rojas's people or by immigration authorities. He couldn't go to the police without implicating himself in human trafficking, which would help no one. He needed help, but from who? As dawn broke gray and damp over the ranch, Tom made a decision. He'd spent the last 3 years isolated, too proud to ask for help, too ashamed to admit failure. That pride had led him to his worst mistake. It was time to risk vulnerability and reach out. Sunday morning, Tom drove into town with Miguel in the passenger seat. The boy tensed as they passed buildings, his hands gripping the door handle, clearly expecting betrayal. "I'm taking you to meet someone," Tom said. "A friend who might be able to help. I need you to trust me, just a little bit, just for now." Miguel didn't relax, but he didn't jump from the moving truck either, which Tom took as a minor victory. They pulled up outside a small white church, and Tom saw Miguel's eyes widen slightly. "Come on," Tom said gently. "There's someone I need to talk to." Father Martin had been serving Satan's Catholic Church for 30 years, and in that time, he'd seen every variation of human struggle and redemption. When Tom walked through the church office door with a frightened boy at his side, the old priest's expression shifted from welcoming to quietly alert. Tom had attended services sporadically over the years, usually appearing only on major holidays or when Sarah had insisted, but Father Martin recognized desperation when he saw it. He gestured them to chairs in his cramped office, moved a stack of hymnals off a worn love seat, and waited with the patience that came from decades of hearing confessions. Tom's story came out in broken pieces, shame making him stumble over words. He explained the drought, the debt, the impossible choices that had led him to that rail yard. He described Rojas and the transaction, the cash changing hands, the boy climbing into his truck. Miguel sat rigid beside him, eyes fixed on a crucifix on the wall, while Tom stripped away every excuse and justification until only the ugly truth remained. When he finished, silence filled the office like water filling a well. Father Martin's weathered face showed no judgment, only a deep sadness that somehow felt worse than condemnation. "You understand what you're describing is human trafficking," Father Martin said finally, his voice gentle but firm. "You participated in a crime, Tom. A serious one." Tom nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. The priest turned to Miguel, switching to Spanish that flowed with obvious fluency. The boy responded hesitantly at first, then with increasing urgency, his words tumbling over each other. Tom couldn't understand the language, but he heard the emotion: fear, loss, desperate love for a mother waiting somewhere across the border. Father Martin listened without interrupting, occasionally asking questions, his expression growing more troubled. After nearly 20 minutes, Father Martin switched back to English. "Miguel's situation is complicated, but not impossible. There are organizations that help children in his circumstances, groups that work with immigration cases involving trafficking victims. Miguel has rights, even as an undocumented minor, and there are paths to legal status for victims of trafficking. But it will take time, and it won't be simple." He looked at Tom directly. "The question is whether you're willing to see this through, knowing it may cost you everything. Coming forward, helping Miguel properly, means potentially facing criminal charges yourself." Tom had thought about little else since the previous day. The ranch was lost anyway, the debt couldn't be paid, and the foreclosure was inevitable. What remained was the chance to do one right thing after so many wrong ones. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "Miguel deserves to be safe, to have a future that isn't about running or hiding. If I have to face consequences to make that happen, so be it." Father Martin studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He picked up his phone and made a call, speaking quietly to someone on the other end. When he hung up, he had the beginnings of a plan. The lawyer who arrived an hour later was a woman named Elena Vasquez, and she specialized in immigration law with a focus on trafficking cases. She was sharp-eyed and direct, asking questions that cut through evasion to facts. She interviewed Miguel at length, taking detailed notes about his journey from Chihuahua, the people who transported him, the conditions at the rail yard, his 2 months of being sold from place to place before Tom. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but Tom saw her hand tighten around her pen when Miguel described some of the places he'd been, some of the work he'd been forced to do. When she interviewed Tom, Elena was blunt about the legal jeopardy he faced. Conspiracy to trafficking, exploitation of a minor, potentially more depending on how prosecutors wanted to pursue it. But she also explained that cooperation could make a difference, that Tom's willingness to come forward and help might mitigate charges. More importantly, his ranch could serve as a safe placement for Miguel while they navigated the legal process, a supervised arrangement that would keep the boy stable and in school rather than in foster care or a detention facility. Tom agreed immediately, relief flooding through him despite the danger to himself. The following weeks transformed the ranch into something it had never been before. Elena filed paperwork that seemed endless, applications for U visas, reports to law enforcement about Rojas and his operation, documentation of Miguel's circumstances. A social worker named Karen began making regular visits, checking on Miguel's well-being and interviewing both him and Tom about their arrangement. Tom signed documents making himself formally responsible for Miguel's care. Understanding this made him vulnerable but also gave Miguel stability. The authorities raided the rail yard, though Rojas had vanished by then, leaving behind only empty shipping containers and scattered evidence of his operation. Miguel enrolled in the local middle school, a development that terrified him initially. He'd had limited formal education in Mexico, and his English, while functional, wasn't strong enough for regular classes. The school assigned him to an ESL program, and Tom found himself sitting at the kitchen table each evening helping with homework, both of them puzzling over math problems and vocabulary lists. Some nights they succeeded, other nights they laughed at their shared confusion and tried again. Slowly, painfully, Miguel began to relax. He started speaking more, sharing stories about his life before, his memories of his father, his worries about his mother. Tom sold his remaining cattle to pay for necessities, clothes that actually fit Miguel, school supplies, decent food. The bank statement still sat on his desk, the foreclosure date circled in red, but it somehow mattered less now. Father Martin organized a discreet fundraiser through the church, and donations began appearing, $50 here, $100 there, from neighbors who knew Tom was in trouble even if they didn't know all the details. It wasn't enough to save the ranch, but it helped with legal fees and daily expenses. Tom accepted the charity with gratitude that felt like learning to breathe after drowning. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Elena's investigation into Rojas's operation had uncovered connections to a larger trafficking network, and federal authorities were interested. Tom's testimony, combined with Miguel's, could help prosecute not just the local operators but people much higher in the organization. In exchange for cooperation, the U.S. Attorney's Office was willing to offer Tom immunity from prosecution. It felt like a miracle Tom didn't deserve, but Elena explained it pragmatically. Prosecutors wanted the big fish, and they needed credible witnesses to catch them. Tom and Miguel would have to testify, which carried its own risks, but they'd be protected from charges themselves. Miguel's U-visa application was approved 6 weeks after filing, a surprisingly quick turnaround that Elena attributed to the strength of his case and the ongoing federal investigation. The approval meant Miguel could legally remain in the United States, could attend school, could work toward citizenship eventually. More importantly, it opened the possibility of his mother joining him legally. Elena began working on those papers immediately, explaining that family reunification cases for trafficking victims often moved faster than standard immigration applications. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Miguel allowed himself to hope. Tom received the final foreclosure notice on a cold December morning. He had 2 weeks to vacate the property. He sat at the kitchen table with the letter in his hands, and the grief finally hit him fully, not just for the ranch, but for his grandfather's dream, his father's legacy, the life he'd thought he was building. He'd failed in every traditional measure of success. He'd lost his marriage, alienated his children, destroyed the family business, and nearly destroyed his soul in the process. But when Miguel came in from the school bus and dropped his backpack on the floor, chattering about a science project and a new friend named David, Tom realized that maybe success wasn't what he thought it was. The auction was scheduled for January 15th, and Tom spent the final weeks at the ranch methodically packing away a lifetime of memories. He sorted through his grandfather's tools in the barn, his father's account books in the office, the accumulation of 3 generations of work and hope. Some things he kept: photos, his grandmother's quilt, his father's pocket watch. Most things he sold or gave away. The furniture, the remaining equipment, the bits and pieces that had filled the house went to neighbors or thrift stores or the dump. Each carload that left felt like shedding weight he hadn't known he was carrying. Miguel helped without being asked, wrapping dishes in newspaper, loading boxes into the truck, working with the same quiet competence he'd shown that first day. But now there was something different in his approach: ownership, investment in an outcome that affected them both. When Tom hesitated over a box of his children's old toys, unable to decide whether to keep or discard memories his adult children no longer wanted, Miguel sat beside him and looked through each item, asking questions about Tom's son and daughter. The conversation that emerged was halting but real, Tom sharing stories about teaching his daughter to ride, his son's fascination with mechanics, the family they'd been before things fell apart. Father Martin arrived one afternoon with pizza and beer, settling at the kitchen table like he belonged there. He'd brought news. The federal investigation had expanded significantly based on Tom and Miguel's testimony. 7 people had been arrested, including 3 connected directly to the rail yard operation. More arrests were expected. "What you did, coming forward," Father Martin said, "it took courage. Real courage, not the easy kind that comes from having no choice, but the hard kind that comes from choosing the right thing over the safe thing." Tom didn't feel courageous. He felt like someone who'd made a terrible mistake and was simply trying to mitigate the damage. Elena called with updates on Miguel's mother. The paperwork was progressing, though immigration bureaucracy moved with frustrating slowness. Rosa Jimenez, Miguel's mother, had been interviewed at the U.S. consulate in Juarez and had provided her testimony about the circumstances that had forced her to send Miguel away. Her case for entry was strong, Elena assured them, but the timeline remained uncertain. Miguel's face when Tom relayed this information showed the strain of hoping for something too important to hope for safely. They marked days off the calendar together, counting down to nothing in particular, just marking time until the future might arrive. The day of the auction dawned clear and cold. Tom and Miguel drove into town rather than watch strangers pick over the ranch like vultures. They went to the diner where Tom had eaten breakfast for 30 years, ordered pancakes and bacon, and sat in comfortable silence. The waitress, Margaret, who'd known Tom since high school, refilled his coffee and squeezed his shoulder without saying anything. Everyone in town knew what was happening at the ranch. Most had no idea about Miguel's circumstances or Tom's role in them. Elena had been adamant about protecting their privacy for safety reasons, but they knew Tom was losing his land, and that was enough for sympathy. Father Martin had worked connections Tom didn't know existed, calling in favors and making requests. The result was a small apartment above a hardware store in town, 2 bedrooms with reasonable rent and an owner willing to take a chance on a man with no credit and complicated circumstances. Tom signed the lease with hands that only shook slightly, promising rent he'd figure out how to pay somehow. Miguel walked through the empty rooms with wide eyes, touching walls that would be theirs, looking out windows at a view of Main Street instead of endless pasture. "This is good," he said finally, and Tom chose to believe him. Employment came from an unexpected source. The owner of the feed store, a man named Bill Henderson who'd known Tom for decades, needed help with inventory and deliveries. The work wasn't glamorous, lifting bags, organizing stock, driving the delivery truck, but it paid hourly with benefits and didn't require the crushing responsibility of running a failing ranch. Tom accepted gratefully, understanding this was charity disguised as employment but grateful nonetheless. Bill's only condition was that Tom show up on time and work hard, and those were things Tom could still do. Miguel thrived in school with an intensity that amazed Tom. Despite the language barriers and educational gaps, the boy attacked learning with determination that spoke of desperation turned productive. His ESL teacher sent home progress reports that glowed with praise. Miguel's vocabulary was expanding exponentially, his reading comprehension improving weekly, his determination inspiring other students. Tom attended parent-teacher conferences feeling odd and out of place, not technically a parent, not legally a guardian yet, but something undefined that was nonetheless real and important. The call came on a Thursday evening in late February. Elena's voice was carefully controlled, professional, but Tom heard excitement underneath. Rosa Jimenez's visa had been approved. She could enter the United States legally within the next 2 weeks, could be reunited with her son, could begin building a life here. Elena explained the details. Rosa would need employment, housing, someone to sponsor her initially, but Tom had stopped listening. Miguel stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, his face showing a transformation from hope to joy to terror all in the span of seconds. What if his mother didn't recognize him? What if she was disappointed in him? What if 6 months apart had created a distance that couldn't be bridged? Tom reached the boy in 2 strides and pulled him into a hug. Miguel collapsed against him, finally allowing himself to be the child he'd been forced to stop being. They stood there while Tom's phone buzzed with Elena providing more details, while the dinner on the stove grew cold, while the winter sun set outside the apartment windows. When Miguel finally pulled back, his face was wet and his breathing unsteady, but he was smiling. "My mother is coming," he said, like the words were a prayer or a miracle. "She's really coming." The 2 weeks before Rosa's arrival passed in a blur of preparation. Tom and Miguel cleaned the apartment obsessively, bought groceries to fill the bare cupboards, arranged the second bedroom with a bed from the thrift store and sheets from Walmart. Miguel wrote letters to his mother that he'd never had the ability to send before, pages and pages in Spanish that covered everything that had happened, everything he felt, everything he needed her to know. Tom helped when he could, though his Spanish was minimal, mostly just sitting with Miguel and offering steady presence while emotions poured onto paper. Father Martin arranged for Rosa's arrival, coordinating with immigration officials and Elena to ensure everything was legal and documented. The day she arrived, Tom drove Miguel to the El Paso airport, watching the boy vibrate with nervous energy for the entire 4-hour drive. They waited at arrivals with a sign Miguel had made, decorated with careful drawings and her name in elaborate letters. When Rosa emerged from the secured area, small and tired but with eyes scanning desperately for her son, Miguel made a sound Tom had never heard before, part sob, part laugh, entirely joy, and ran to her. Tom stood back, giving them space, watching a reunion that felt sacred in its intensity. Rosa held Miguel like she'd never let him go again, speaking rapid Spanish through her tears, kissing his forehead and his cheeks and his hands. Miguel clung to her with equal desperation, the carefully constructed maturity he'd maintained for months crumbling away to reveal the frightened child underneath. Other travelers gave them space, sensing they were witnessing something private and precious. Tom felt his own throat tighten, grief and happiness mixing until he couldn't tell which was which. The drive back was different. Rosa sat in the front seat at Tom's insistence, while Miguel leaned forward from the back, one hand on his mother's shoulder, needing constant physical contact to confirm she was real. Rosa's English was limited, but she looked at Tom with an expression that needed no translation. Gratitude, wariness, the complex acknowledgement of someone who knows her child was harmed but also helped by the same person. Tom tried to explain, stumbling through words about his mistakes and his intentions, but Rosa just reached over and touched his hand briefly. "You brought him home," she said in careful English. "Thank you." The apartment became too small for 3 people, but they made it work for the first weeks. Rosa slept in Miguel's room while arrangements were made for longer-term housing. Elena worked with a refugee resettlement organization that helped Rosa find employment at a restaurant, menial work that paid minimum wage but provided income and, eventually, a path to stability. Father Martin's church covered her first month's deposit on a small rental house, and Tom spent weekends helping Rosa and Miguel move their minimal possessions, painting walls, fixing a leaky faucet, making the space livable. Spring came to Texas with wildflowers and storms. Tom stood in his apartment one Saturday morning, drinking coffee and watching rain streak the windows, and realized he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not happiness exactly, not the absence of struggle or uncertainty, but a deep, settled sense that he was where he was supposed to be, doing what he was supposed to do. The ranch was gone, sold to developers who planned to turn it into a subdivision. His children still didn't call often. His ex-wife had remarried and moved to Arizona. But Miguel stopped by after school most days, helping with chores and doing homework at Tom's kitchen table. Rosa invited him for dinner on Sundays, serving food that reminded him eating could be about community rather than just sustenance. The legal proceedings concluded in late spring. Tom testified at a federal trial, describing the rail yard in Rojas and the terrible choice he'd made. Miguel testified too, though the prosecution kept him shielded and brief, understanding the trauma involved. The defendants were convicted on multiple counts, sentenced to lengthy prison terms that the judge called appropriate given the heinous nature of crimes against children. Tom left the courthouse feeling like some weight had been lifted, not absolution but perhaps the beginning of forgiveness, at least from himself. On Miguel's 13th birthday, Tom and Rosa threw him a party in the small house Rosa rented. Father Martin came, and Bill from the feed store, and Miguel's teacher Mrs. Henderson, and the few friends Miguel had made at school. They ate cake and played games and sang happy birthday in 2 languages. Miguel blew out his candles with his mother's arms around him and his friends laughing nearby, and Tom thought about all the paths that had led to this moment, the drought and desperation, the terrible choice at the rail yard, the storm and confession and slow building of something like redemption. Tom never got the ranch back. His children eventually visited, warily at first, confused by the transformation in their father but gradually accepting this new version of him. Sarah sent a letter, not seeking reconciliation but acknowledging that Tom seemed to have found some kind of peace. The debts were eventually forgiven or dismissed or simply absorbed into the enormous bureaucracy of American finance. Tom continued working at the feed store, and the work was enough. More than enough. It provided purpose and structure and the simple satisfaction of a job completed properly. Miguel graduated from middle school with honors, his English now fluent and his dreams expansive. He wanted to be a lawyer, he told Tom one evening, someone who helped people navigate the systems that had nearly destroyed him. Tom had no doubt the boy would accomplish exactly that. Rosa opened her own small restaurant eventually, serving authentic Chihuahuan cuisine that drew customers from 3 counties. Tom ate there weekly, his usual table by the window, and Rosa always brought him extra salsa with a smile that had become familiar and comfortable. Years later, when people asked Tom about that period of his life, the loss of the ranch, the drought, the desperate choices, he never told the full story. Some parts were too painful, some parts were protected by privacy agreements, and some parts felt too sacred to share with casual curiosity. But he would say, carefully, that he'd lost everything he thought mattered and found something more important in the ruins. He'd learned that redemption wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic transformations but about showing up every day, making better choices, and building something worthwhile from the WR.